we've got our panels back, which is the most important thing. Now, this is the plenary session. I'd ask everyone, firstly, not to make speeches, but to make pithy points or ask questions. Can you say who you are? Press the button you'll need to hold your hand up to let me know you want to ask questions. I can see one going up already. I don't think there's going to be a shortage of comments. And what I'm really looking for is constructive suggestions. So this is going to be implemented. You tell us how it should be implemented. Okay? And there are hands going up everywhere. Yes, okay. I'm going to start there. Say who you are. No. Gentleman here.
Good afternoon. My name is Professor Stefan Elba. I'm the Director of a Center for Global Health Policy at the University of Sussex. My questions are very short. They're really points of clarification. The first thing that I'd like to know is the proposal that the EMA will, upon market authorization of a drug, make it a requirement to make all clinical trial data available publicly? Or is it only that data which is submitted as part of the application? And secondly, will the data that will be made publicly available be restricted to only some parts or some of the modules of the clinical trials, or will it be comprehensive, i.e. including all modules of the clinical trials?
Okay. I think we'll collect a few and then we'll go to the panel. I think if there's technical questions that are easily answered by EMA, then you might choose to just come in and answer the sort of straightforward technical ones. Do you want to do that one now, actually?
Very short. Question number one, we can only make available what we have.
Yeah.
Number two, this is exactly the focus of debate. This is what we are here for. Should it be everything at any level? Should it be restricted, etc.?
You want to give an answer to that?
Is there no way that the EMA could move towards making it conditional to make all of the clinical
trials? Okay, well, so that's your opinion, it should be all. Okay. I think we'll go down rows. That's probably the easiest way to do it.
Trish Groves, Deputy Editor of BMJ, British Medical Journal. It's a question to the EMA about the next steps. Are you going to take written evidence from all of us or people like us and over the next few months build your policy based on that? Because verbal evidence is fantastic, but it's inevitably very limited.
Okay, I mean, again, I don't want this to be a question-answer session with the EMA. That's not the purpose of it. You know their address. I'm sure you can write to them. But this is a stakeholder consultation, so it's part of that consultation. Okay. Yes.
Okay, my name is Carmela Krleža. I'm from Canada, but I'm also from Croatia. So my question to EMA, my suggestion actually to EMA is to open the possibility to send after the fact more comments as the FDA did a few years ago, because it's a rich group and it's not enough time. The question is, could you simultaneously engage, start now with disclosing data that you have, move forward by engaging to develop better methodologies and standards everybody's talking about to improve it. And in that case, I would advise also that you connect with other big regulators and even funders, because trials are not done just in Europe, not just in England. They are global. Problems are global. So we would be better off if we could do it this way. So there are three parts. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. You're next. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Rabinowitz from Bar Ilan University in Israel. We have a large data sharing initiative, which is a private-public initiative funded by the IMI called NewMeds, which covers a lot of different aspects of drug development in schizophrenia and depression. And as part of that, we have, together with 5 EFPIA companies, put together a repository of data, clinical trial patient-level data from 5 companies, and we look at aspects about drug development, ways to make shorter trials, ways to make more efficient trials in the areas of schizophrenia and depression. And over the last 3 years in putting together with this repository, we've actually dealt with a lot of these issues that were raised today, and just wanted to make people aware of our initiative. And it's sort of a midway point. This is something that is both public and private partnership together with the EFPIA companies working together to look at the data. So it's not a situation where data is shared with all of the public, but it's a step, it's a step along the way, and I think that we have been able to generate some very useful knowledge for the field, and I would encourage these efforts. I mean, our data sets alone, we have billions, literally billions of dollars worth of data. Trials cost between $35 to $50 million in schizophrenia, and we have 60 such trials and similar in depression. So I'm sorry it wasn't a question, it was more of a comment.
No, it was a very nice marketing exercise there, so down there.
My name is Beate Wiesler. I'm from a IQWiC and Health Technology Assessment Agency in Germany, and I would like to come forward with a pragmatic suggestion. There seems to be some need for discussion concerning how to make individual patient data available. There have been suggestions of a two-tier system, like more or less rich data sets. Maybe we could go an intermediate step, because I think this step could be gone immediately and quickly. That is, make the full study reports available with the summary data. We would have the protocol, we would have the analysis plan, we would have the summary data on all endpoints. We have been working with this data since 2005. This has substantially improved our information about studies and had a relevant influence on our outcomes, the outcomes of our assessment. Therefore, I think this low-hanging fruit, this easy-to-go step, would be a major improvement in the situation.
Okay, thank you. That's a helpful suggestion in front there. And then I'll go over to the left. You should be aware that if you can't see me, I can't see you. There is a very large pillar over there. I was warned about this in advance. Waving at me through it will not have any effect. There.
So my name is Roland Gordon-Beres at Radio Free Biosciences in Belgium. My question relates to the international consequences, especially on legal grounds, of disclosing clinical data in Europe relating to patients potentially not being European patients.
Okay, so a question about the consequences for patients from other jurisdictions, as it were. Okay, there's one more question over there, and then I'll come over here. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Theresa Alves, and I'm representing the International Society of Drug Bulletins. We have in the past very frequently requested access to documents from the EMA, and one aspect that we have not yet talked today is the time for release, because I think it would be important to define the maximum period of time to deliver the information, otherwise the data is useless. And I have a question also. How will this openness from the EMA address aspects related to the accumulated evidence of harms from pharmacovigilance? You know, how for us it's not very clear on how this will be articulated with the pharmacovigilance implementation, which specifies that there's different thresholds for access to data. We consider that all data should be public and available for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Just to give notice to the panel, I'm going to go through a few more questions, and then I'll do a round for you, and you can respond to anything or everything. Well, preferably not everything, otherwise we'll never get through it. There were some questions over here now, right at the back. Right at the back. There's a microphone up there.
Hi, I'm Ian Trinaskiewicz. I'm an open access publisher of some journals which have published some very large clinical trial data sets. My question is about funding. How are you going to fund continued access to the data? And the other point is that the more open that you are, the more efficient and probably the less money it's going to cost. There are places you could put data now that would not cost you any money and would assure permanent accessibility, linkability, and citability of that data. So the more open you are, the less money that it may cost. If you are going to make data openly accessible, then I would urge you to publish under licenses which permit reuse as freely as possible. Ginny mentioned public domain waivers. I think that would be very important.
Okay, thank you. There were some questions in the front row. Okay.
Merete Jørgensen, Novo Nordisk. I would like to pose two questions or two comments. First, in relation to being a statistician, I'm of course worried not only about wrong analysis, but certainly also about the type 1 error. We have for so many years learned about the pre-specification and the need in order to preserve the type 1 error. And this was the entire background for the the registration in trial registries of our trials, that we should be able to look at the analysis being published, were being the ones that were registered. Yeah. And then my second comment is related to the global perspective. It was already mentioned that patients, what about patients outside of Europe? In the US, we are legally obliged to put into the informed consent that the trials will be registered in clinicaltrials.gov and that no data apart from the results will be made public at the clinicaltrials.gov site. So what will happen if the US patients are now in a European submission and then made publicly available?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yep. We'll come up this road now. So
okay, the name's David Healy. I would like to make 2 quick points. First, as a patient, I guess, although I work for Cardiff University, and it's this. I think the issue about informed consent is extremely important, but it's been twisted around to the way I would have usually viewed it. The question has been raised about, do patients consent to their data being made public? I think you need to consider very, very carefully this issue, and I believe the informed consent form should say, do patients consent to their data being hidden, being sequestered? The other thing I want to raise is to come back to the point just made by my colleague here on the left, which is if we're looking at issues like type 1 kind of mistakes and other approaches towards the data, and we've looked at the issue of privacy rights generally, well, when I take a pill, I take both the chemical and the information that goes with it. And it's up to me at the end of the day to scrutinize the information that goes with the particular chemical. If people in the room or EMA are proposing to restrict who will analyze the data, who will generate the information, they are potentially infringing my privacy rights.
Okay, I think we've had enough to go around the panel again, actually. So we'll store up some more questions. There are plenty more hands around. Let's go to the panel. But I urge you to, as it were, rather than agreeing with individuals, answer the question that challenges you. So, Peter, there was a question about type 1 errors and the question of the pre-specification of the question. Why don't you kick off with that and anything else you want?
Well, let me give a counter-argument. Statistical analysis plans are often not made or finished before a trial is near completion. And then the drug industry always tells us that this has happened without them peeping at the data. But we know from internal company reports that that's not always true. So there is already a problem in the way the companies make statistical analysis. That's the first thing I would say. The other thing is that by registering a protocol, which could be done very easily by when you go to the EMA website, you just click, yes, I have a protocol, and where is it? Then we know there is a protocol where we can look up what was the hypothesis, what are the tests, and in this way we can guard against too many fishing expeditions. The third thing I will say is that it's not very dissimilar from what epidemiologists they face with large data sets. The risk of fishing expeditions is always there, and we deal with it by having pre-published protocols.
Okay, thank you. I felt at one point you sort of said allegedly, but anyway, Susan.
Well, you know, I'm not a statistician, but we write our protocols, we write our statistical analysis plans. If we need to make a protocol.
Actually, you've got the microphone. I think you need to do the question.
All right. So we write our protocols and we finalize them, and we write our statistical analysis plans, and those are finalized. If we make a protocol amendment or a change to our proposed statistical analysis, that is documented and dated, and that's what we will be submitting. So certainly, I'm worried that that allegation was slightly unfair.
Yes, so I'll perhaps respond to the question, well, two of the questions and comments generally. The first one, pertinent to whether it be all modules or not. I think my understanding is that it would not, and I think there is an argument that it's not appropriate for all modules to be proactively available, because actually they include information which is sensitive, and it's taken a great deal of time to work up particular analytical methods, for example. And I think there's an argument, again, coming back to the greater good, and I know perhaps there's an argument from members of the panel that almost infers that the pharmaceutical industry is not. But my experience is genuinely that actually we have to have the appropriate balance of great science, great collaboration, but also the commercial environment where, in fact, the huge investments that have to be made to successfully see these drugs through are enabled.
So who should decide?
Well, I'm. This may be an example where I'd refer back to Sue, but I think it may be appropriate to have an independent based on a pre-agreed format for the type of information that is legitimate to share.
Okay, so there's a practical suggestion, but okay, that's fine.
Could I just respond, because touching on the comment from the gentleman from New Meds and the collaboration, I mean, I think perhaps I would like to encourage other members of the panel to see real encouragement. Somebody showed me a diagram of the exponential rate of availability of clinical trials data that's open in the public domain. And I guess there will be strong arguments that is partially down to the pharmaceutical industry becoming more enlightened, and it may also be down to the pressure applied. And I think you can make arguments, but I think you should or we collectively should regard that as a success, because the rate of progress and the rate of appearance of that data is very, very significant. And you just following on from the more collaborative type projects that the gentleman representing New Meds collaboration described.
Okay, thank you. Ben.
Just three very brief things. Firstly, to respond to Susan Forda, it is extremely prevalent, the problem of primary outcomes being switched, and that's been demonstrated repeatedly. So I think it's not true to say that we can always rely on published protocols resulting in adequate primary analyses. It was very good to hear somebody talking about type 1 and type 2 error, because I think we've been slightly distracted here, imagining that reanalyses of data is only to catch people out when they've done bad research. But actually, the Early Breast Cancer Trialists Collaborative Group produce spectacular individual patient data meta-analyses that give very, very accurate estimates of the benefits of different interventions in breast cancer. And that I think shows the power not just of open access to data as a transparency tool, but also to get just very simply better and more accurate answers. And lastly, it's great to hear that IMI and EFPIA have collaborated and given New Meds lots of individual patient data. But what restrictions are put on your use of data? Are you allowed to do comparative effectiveness research with the data that you currently hold?
Very, very briefly.
That's not our fault.
You better press the microphone if you're going to.
Our agreement is to look at, push the button. Our agreement is to look at issues that compare active treatments to placebo. We don't do between active treatment comparisons. That's not in our mandate.
So my concern is that this is an example of where the release of data is controlled by industry and where licenses restrict the secondary uses. And I think that's something that we need to be very aware of when we also applaud the sharing of data with individuals like organisations like New Meds.
Okay, Virginia.
I just want to go back very quickly to the point that Neil said at the end of the last session, if everyone can remember that back that far, which was that he said this isn't easy. I don't think anyone's saying this is easy. This is why we're kind of trying to thrash this out. So I just want to note that that's where we are, that we're not going to not do it because it's not easy. So the type 1 issue, that's a problem for us at journals all the time, obviously. The PLOS journals and others have been at the forefront of requiring protocols. It's been really important in transparency around trial reporting. I think it just shows how important it is to require something. And that also is true, for example, of clinical trial registration. I said at the end of the last session that we need to do something to make this palatable to the drug companies. But at the same time, clinical trial registration came about because the journal said, we're going to do this or we're not going to publish your papers. Now, I know there are lots of issues with trials not being published. I'm furious nodding from many people in this room. But nonetheless, it was mandated and has been effective because of that. So I would echo what Ian said about the license being very important, and actually a further point that was also made around internationalism. I absolutely agree that what is done here will reverberate around the world. So that's not just true for the patient data, but it is true for any policies that come out of here. And I think we should be cognizant of that. And I presume that EMA is kind of actively discussing that with people.
Okay, thank you, François.
I will only comment on the informed consent. In the past, I've been involved in discussions with public research bodies on the necessity in the informed consent and participant information to not only explain the volume of blood, for example, that has to be taken at each visit, but how many tubes this volume represents, because the participant cannot evaluate volume, but we can certainly count the number of tubes. And this is because patients were reporting us that they want to be sure that the study they participate to has a purpose, and that their blood will not serve other purpose that they were not informed about. And we have established this protocol with the research agency. And on a broader scale, but related to this, biobanks and tissue banks, we had the same discussion. Plus one problem here is that the volume of the tissue is limited, and you cannot give your tissue for all types of purposes, which adds one difficulty. But here it was very clear that patients who consent to give their tissues for some research are really interested to know exactly which research. Not all patients are consenting to give their tissues for any type of research, particularly if the research that is conducted is not the initial research where they were invited to give their tissue. And I think BBMRI is still working on ethical implications of giving tissues to banks, and here we have to follow these efforts to standardize the informed consent for biobanks and see how this could apply to clinical trials if the data will have to be used by third parties. I think it goes on the same line, and for the participant, it's equally important.
Okay, let's have some more questions. Okay, in the front row, you've got your hand up first. Yeah.
My name is Peter Bogart. I'm a lawyer with the firm Covington & Burling. I've been working with life sciences companies for about 25 years. And Sir Mark, you asked a very important question. What harm can come from publication of those data? But I fear we've missed one very significant potential harm. When you look at the practice and what I see passing my desk, I see lots of companies asking for access to the data. And why is that? Because it is also extremely important for their commercial plans. The clinical study reports, for instance, give a roadmap on how to develop a product. You can do a shortcut of efforts based on those documents. And you can also submit the data and the documentation for regulatory submissions for competing products. That means that there's going to be less protection for the innovative products, which automatically is going to mean that there will be fewer innovative products available. And that is also in the public interest. That's also why we have Article 39 of TRIPS, which was mentioned in the Cochrane case, and unfortunately was taken out of the debate because there the EMA took the decision we're not going to continue the argumentation on TRIPS, but only focus on the transparency regulation. So that is a relevant question or issue for the if, but I know you don't want to put that on the table for now, but on how as well. And let me come to the how.
Well, of course, we heard from the European Ombudsman at the beginning, and we could have a whole debate between you and the European Ombudsman because they obviously drew a different conclusion to you.
No, I don't think so. Let me explain why.
Briefly.
But I would love to have a debate with everybody. And I really congratulate the EMA for organizing this panel discussion because this goes to the heart of the industry and it goes to the heart of the pharmaceutical healthcare system. But what should be done if we really go to the how? That is, you can't give general access. You must have private access, and it's exactly also the proposal which the Ombudsman made in the recommendations. He said that based on Article 39 TRIPS, you should have a system where access can be guaranteed for research purposes, good research purposes, and there was no doubt about the quality of the research purposes in that case, but you shouldn't give it to everybody. And now it's given to everybody. So that's also what is in the UDRA vigilance guidance of the EMA.
And how would you regulate the private access?
Well, that's what has been discussed already, but you need a system, first of all, where it is recognized that the non-clinical and clinical data in a dossier are presumed to be commercially confidential.
Right.
And I know that goes against what is being said here, but if that's the case, you can have a private access system.
Okay, well, we might have a discussion, because it obviously is a key point, but we'll have a discussion amongst the panel in a moment on the question of confidential, of what the commercial value of the data sets are.
But maybe I can refer to the UDRA vigilance guidance of the EMA, which is an example of the process where they say, well, obviously it has to be in line with data privacy rules, etc. But also there's an ad hoc committee which reviews the request for access to data. There's a confidentiality agreement that has to be signed by the people who want the data, and that there are guarantees that the data may not be transferred to any third party. And that's exactly what the EMA has proposed to do for UDRA vigilance. Why not here?
Okay, that's a well-made point. I can see lots of hands there, and I'll come back to them, but I don't want to be prejudicial against the edges of the room. So over there.
Yeah, hi. My name's Carl Hennigan. I'm Director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at the Oxford University. I work on an NIHR study looking at the evidence of Tamiflu and zanamivir with a couple of colleagues here at the front. I look a bit dishevelled because I've been working on a contract negotiation with GSK last night. There are some fundamental issues here that are going on that are plainly wrong, and people don't have the experience about individual data or the use of data. The first is, if you go and ask, and I've done this 3 times now, and I'm involved in 5 IPDs, half the people want to go back to ethics. They go back to ethics, and people always at ethics say, there's no problem, you can have the data. It's an issue of anonymization. So you should set standards for anonymization. The second issue is, which we're in a bind with, if I take data from the EMA or GSK, once I do an analysis and publish that analysis, I'm going to make all the information available to make that reproducible. Now, that's the only bad analysis. All these people are going on about bad analysis. You're wrong. The only bad analysis is ones that are not transparent and reproducible. You can FOI me, I'm a public servant if you want the data from me. If I want to publish in the BMJ now, they require that data. We are in a terrible bind with these companies who are saying, we'll give you the data. However, there are restrictions. It's not going to work. The third issue,
briefly,
which is a really important issue, is the issue of limited liability. Companies want us to take on, as a university, unlimited liability, which our university won't accept.
Okay, thank you for that. The one more at the back there, or 2 more at the back there, and then I'll go over there.
Hi, my name's Caroline Dines. I'm from the Royal Society. I just wanted to go back to basics. I just wondered if we had a consensus on what data meant and what you thought data sharing actually involved and how far that data should go. So it's not just about the results or the methods, but is there going to be a question of conflict of interests of those conducting the trial themselves, and whether that's in the public interest to know that conflict of interest? And yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm Martin Landry, patient, doctor, participant, clinical trialist, and I work at the University of Oxford.
Can you speak up a bit?
Sorry, Martin Landry, patient, doctor, participant, clinical trialist, work at the University of Oxford. It seems to me that the objective of this whole exercise is to get reliable information about treatment, and nobody complains about that objective. If that is the driver, then the thing that we need is the results. And I think there is a distinction between results and data. The regulators are already in a position where they can assess the reliability of the transformation of data into those results that we want to see. So I think that by instantly going down to the individual data items, we create a whole series of problems, which make some of us comfortable and some of us very uncomfortable, and yet we want to see rapid progress. My final comment would be that I think a number of these issues are technically solved problems. CDISC will allow us to exchange data. It's not perfect, but the companies are all doing it every time they submit data to the FDA. And the clinicaltrials.gov already requires the publication of patient flow, of baseline characteristics, of outcomes and adverse events. Now that's results, not data, but we could be a long way forward if we were just to simply follow that model. The individual patient data approach for meta-analysis is incredibly important, but it does require huge amounts of specialist effort. And I think if we put all our time and efforts now into that aspect, we miss the bigger picture, which is simply the trials that have been done. Let's see the protocol from the day it's approved, and let's see the results from the day they come out.
Okay, thank you. I want to have a round of discussion because we're getting very near to the nub of the debate here, I think. And the nub of the debate is that I think that probably most people would agree that there are benefits to transparency and being able to analyze data in the most rigorous way possible. I doubt if anyone will argue against that. The other side of the argument is that there is a commercial value in some of this data. And how do you balance those two opposing imperatives? And let me ask those that are there to, as it were, who are proponents of just complete open access, to just explore the nub of the commercial value, and the other way around for the people of the pharma industry. So, Peter, there is commercial value in some of this stuff.
Yes, but this is a very easy thing to respond to. I wrote in the BMJ when we had gotten access to the EMA 2 years ago that if commercial success depends on withholding data that are important for rational decision-making by doctors and patients, there is something fundamentally wrong with our priorities in healthcare, and it leads to lots of deaths. And let me just say one thing more. We are not allowed to exploit patients according to the Helsinki Declaration. And this is exactly what we are doing if we try to argue based on commercial issues that it's beneficial for the drug companies to keep something secret and all that sort of thing. Let's get on. We have already decided that the ship has left the harbor, that we heard here from the very beginning of this afternoon.
Okay, that was clear enough. Susan? You can respond to that.
Oh, yeah, I think this is one that I can respond to. I mean, I think that I tried to say at the beginning is that the industry is in favour of transparency, and we are on a journey and we do want to benefit the patient as much as possible. There are very real concerns, though, associated with the release of some of this information depending on the product and where you are in the life cycle of the product. And in particular, the first one is the exploitation of these data, particularly outside the European Union, for products which maybe don't have a patent in another country, and you use those data to put in the submission and get your approval. And what we've been highlighted is that there's particular concerns with countries, and these aren't tiny markets, Australia and Canada, there's a real concern. So that's the first one. The second one is, as I mentioned earlier, where later in the life cycle of the product, you're going for a use patent, and if all those data are already in the public domain, you will have the accusation from people to stop you getting the patent that it was obvious, so you won't get it. And then the third one, which I think Peter Bogart mentioned, which is slightly more difficult, which is this one is, at what point does your bioanalytical method or your very innovative design become something that actually is very commercially valuable for you, and therefore you don't necessarily want that to be put on the EMA website. So and as we move forward, these are things which we're working through in the reactive position that the EMA is at the moment. And some of these topics are coming up, and it is extremely difficult to work through. And certainly we would like better clarity and definition around the constraints of that, or the border of that, before we agree on what any proactive strategy should be in the future.
Can I just come back to Peter and challenge you, which is that, I mean, do you agree that the pharma industry is a manifestation of capitalism, and the nature of capitalist companies is that they do actually have a property that is of commercial and intellectual value?
Of course, you're right. But as David Healy said, then we need patient consent forms that says that your data might be sequestered if they don't please the sponsor. It's not viable. Of course, we have a capitalistic system, but it's not the best system in the world when it comes to healthcare.
And how would you fund the development of drugs?
That's very easy. Actually, most breakthroughs in drug treatment come from publicly funded research. This has been shown in several studies. So publicly funded development of drugs would be a huge benefit. Then we can also afford to use the drugs. They might even be able to afford them in the third world.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, Neil, over to you.
Yeah, so at the risk of making this circular, perhaps I respond to Peter. I think we enter this with an understanding that there is a balance to be found, and without any particularly entrenched positions. But I think unless we do respect the fact that there will be data in those modules that is perceived to be and will actually be commercially sensitive, we're not appropriately recognizing the interests of the companies who make the enormous investments to actually get these drugs through. And the pharmaceutical industry, I think, has gone through a phase of recognizing that it needs to do many things better and it needs to improve its effectiveness. And I think is actually quite open to a sort of self-analysis, and in some cases, a self-analysis which finds real fault in certain areas. But I think unless we respect that environment where we actually can protect the critical data, we will not respect the model that allows the investment to be made. And the bottom line, and the most important thing, is we will not bring the benefit to the patients. Whilst I agree with Peter, and I don't think any pharmaceutical industry representative would say different, that academic science makes a tremendous contribution to the breakthroughs, the basic understanding of the science. But frankly, having been both in academia and industry brings a very important and critical, is, apart from anything else, enormous investment to bring those things through to actually the point where we understand not only design optimal molecules, but understand how they can bring benefit.
Thank you. I'm going to do something unfair in a minute, and so I'm going to give notice to the person I'm going to do something unfair. There's another regulator sitting in the room, Kent Woods, and so I'm going to ask you in a minute to reflect on what you're hearing this afternoon and comment how this plays out in the UK. But before you do that, and to, as I say, be fair and give you notice, Ben is next.
Well, I mean, people should be able to make lots of money from making good drugs that work very well. I'm extremely relaxed about that. I think that's a good thing. We're very used to making a balance between the commercial needs of companies and the needs of patients in society. That's why we have patents, for example, that give exclusive rights to manufacture and sell drugs, rather than just giving them away as cheaply as they can possibly be made. We need to negotiate where we draw the line here, involving the public. And I think, if anyone seriously wants to say that industry should be allowed to withhold from the patients who take drugs important information about the risks and benefits of those treatments, if you seriously want to say that you want to withhold that information from the patients who take drugs, then I invite you to go ahead and try and have that conversation with the public. But I really don't think that if they learn that that's what you're genuinely proposing, that they will give you a very warm reception.
Well, there you are. We'll have some responses to that in a minute. Virginia.
So this debate's taking a very interesting turn, and not one that I thought it was going to. It's a really fascinating debate about the role of commercial companies in developing drugs. And I have to say, I think that what's happening here is that some of the arguments we're hearing are essentially the companies are talking themselves out of a reason for being allowed to do trials. I think that if they can't figure out a way of making this work along the lines of the type of open data that we're talking about here, it's going to be, it's simply not feasible for them to be able to continue to do drug trials. I'm not the first person to say that. Fiona Godley from the BMJ has said it, and other editors have too, that there is a fundamental conflict of interest between drug companies doing their own trials on their own drugs, and I think that's what we're hearing today. I also think that what Carl raised about the legal liability is another fascinating example of how the companies are trying to use commercial pressure to stop the good use of data. It's a sort of classic tactic, as it were, is you can do what you like, but just beware, this may cost you millions and millions. That's almost, that's no freedom to do anything. So I think we need to have a very serious debate in this context about what the role of commercial companies is in conducting trials.
If the assumption is that commercially confidential information, patent rights, intellectual property drive innovation, and that innovation drives medical progress, there was a time where there was no patent rights, and still the pharmaceutical industry was growing, particularly in countries like Germany, for example, where the patents were introduced quite lately. So I'm not completely sure that the patent right and intellectual property is the only driver of innovation and medical progress. Still, we see that there are many proposals to conduct some developments with with products which are already in the public domain, but nobody really starts the development because of the impossibility to have a patent for that product again, or difficulties to return on investment. So the truth is that it may well be that there are many developments which are stopped or which don't start because there are no incentives for that development. And among the incentives that are sometimes absent, it's difficult to decide if really the fear of sharing the design of a trial, which is a very innovative design, is really an obstacle or not. But I tend to think that here more transparency, more dissemination of the development plans and data which have been previously collected and could be used by other teams to facilitate the development of new indications could serve also the medical progress.
Okay, Kent.
Thank you very much, Mark, for giving me the floor. It's been a fascinating discussion, and one could pick up so many aspects of it, but I think there are just two which I'd like to draw attention to. The first is the quite fundamental philosophical point about the role of the market mechanism in product development, and it's been touched on in the last few minutes about the role of the industry in taking its own innovations through to exploitation and clinical use. And I think one has to take a sort of the societal interest in this. The reality is that mechanism has been very effective in taking through a very productive phase of drug discovery and development over the last half century. And I think we need to be quite careful about suggesting that somehow the public sector could take over doing that research, because there is not the track record to support that hypothesis. So I think we must recognize the limitations of the market mechanism. There are some areas where it doesn't work, but nonetheless, I think before we sort of cast it out wholesale, we need to be very careful about the alternatives. The second thing which interests me greatly about the discussion is that we've been very concerned with because of the nature of the topic that we're focused on today, about the decision-making process at the point of market authorization. Now, over the years, the mechanisms that we have, certainly in the EMA and in the national authorities, for doing robust and sound analyses of the evidence at the point of market authorization have become very strong. For instance, and I put three elements of this. Firstly, the legal powers to have access to all the data that are relevant to that decision, whether or not those data relate to the specific indication for which the market authorization is being sought. That is clearly of great value, that the data available ought to be complete on the basis of law. The second thing is that we have very robust mechanisms for controlling conflict of interest in the people who are making those judgments. And the third thing is that we have access to very strong science, not only in the in-house scientific staff, but also the use of external experts. And for instance, when a market authorization by the centralized route comes to CHMP, you have access to, you have essentially the entire science resource of the 27 member states available to you. So I think the foundations of that decision-making process are very strong. And I think one has to question the public value, as it were, of setting up and investing heavily public money, and we're talking about public resource, a kind of parallel universe of analysts who will then go over the same data all over again. I'm not saying that that shouldn't happen, and clearly in interests of transparency it ought to be possible, but that's not really where the public interest suggests we ought to put this limited public capacity. And that is actually looking at the changing database over time. Once the product is out on the market, and there is a continuous accumulation of additional data, which will over time perhaps change the risk-benefit perception of that particular product. And although it hasn't been the main focus of the discussion today, I think when we look at the academic, the public sector analytical capacity to look at risk-benefit information, that is a finite resource, and we ought to perhaps focus it more towards the longer term life cycle of a product, when it does get harder and harder to say that all the data have been actually brought into the frame when we're looking at the evolving view of risk-benefit. But that's an observation. I don't have the solution, but I think I would like to raise the point that public sector analytical capacity is limited. We ought to make sure that we don't get too hung up on the bits that I think the regulatory process has been set up pretty well to do in the public interest.
So that's very helpful and quite provocative. I mean, let me try and paraphrase you very unfairly and say that the regulator does this very well already, and maybe this is a sledgehammer that's hitting the wrong nut, and the data that really matters is the data that either are or aren't collected once the drug is in use post-authorization. What's your responses to that? Is that a fair or an unfair paraphrase, Kent?
I think that is a robust but not unjust paraphrase.
I keep starting at this end. Let's start at the other end. Francois.
I think something, well, I agree with this, but I'd like to add something. When a patient participates in a trial, he trusts the system. He trusts the data will be used appropriately. He knows that in most cases, even if it's not completely generalized, there are parts of the civil society, patient or consumers organizations working with the agencies that authorize the trials, that monitors the trials, the ethics committees, and ultimately the regulators who analyze the data and who then make decisions. And we, in this part of the world, have achieved quite interesting level of working relations. And we, as patient organizations, we know how these agencies are working. In most cases, we have working relations, and some of us are members of their committees. We are witness of the process. Sometimes we can change it and adapt it. In other words, we are working, we are trying to build the trust between the civil society and the regulatory world. And maybe this is not symmetrical. And this is not symmetrical, I would say, as there are others who could have access to this data with whom we have no working relations. We think sometimes they are completely opaque. We don't know how they work exactly. There is not the same level of relations that we could use to guarantee the trial participants that everything that can be made to guarantee a good quality trial and a good use of the data is also made by these other parties, because in many cases we don't know who they are, how they work. We are not involved in the governance of their institutions, and when we ask them questions, they don't reply, etc. So I think this is something that also has to be considered.
Virginia.
So I think that Kent said that that the regulatory authorities are already doing an okay job at analysing all the data or looking at all the analysis of the data. Well, I thought we'd probably agree that that isn't the case in a substantial number of cases. So I think I'd have to disagree with that. I also think that Francois suggests that patients put their trust in the process that we have at the moment. And actually, I think they should be rather nervous of the process as it is at the moment. And it is probably not functioning as well as it could do. And I don't share some of your concerns about the idea that we should be scared about putting these data out for other people to analyse, because that comes back to another point that Kent made, which was that there's potentially a huge cost to having all these data reanalysed by layers and layers of analysts. But we're not talking about this being a publicly funded thing. This will be something that is done by other academics, other individuals, groups that have an interest in doing it themselves.
Who funds the academics?
Okay, all right, fine, but it's not something that we have to put a process in place for. We're not saying that we're putting a whole level of bureaucry above it.
I just want clarification.
No, fair enough. Well, it could be other companies, so it could, there you go, come from the other companies. All right, those are my points.
Ben, are you aiming your sledgehammer at the wrong nut?
As I've said before, I agree with Kent that the regulator does the job fairly well. But I think regulators are trying to do a very different job to what doctors and patients are trying to do when they make a decision. Mm-hmm. Because regulators are saying, is it in the interests of society that this drug should be available at all, ever, for any use in any circumstance, no matter how bizarre? And a doctor and a patient in a room together are trying to decide, is this the right drug for this person to take right now? They both need access to the individual patient data, but for very different reasons. So I don't think we need access to this data to try and second-guess the decisions that the EMA have made about approving a drug. I don't actually really care about approval. It's a very low bar, and we often want not very good second-best drugs to be on the market for when patients have idiosyncratic reactions to the best one. What we want this information for is comparative effectiveness research. We want to do the same thing that breast cancer trialists do, individual patient meta-analysis, and find out the best possible answer about which treatment is best. So we're using the same information to answer different questions.
Okay, and just to return to you on the capitalism question, do you acknowledge a role for know-how as well as patent protection in commercial activity?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
Well, you can make money through patents, but you can also make money through your know-how, and most companies use a combination of the two.
Yes, of course, but I don't think that there's a tension between that and being transparent about the effectiveness and risks of your treatment. Okay, Peter. Neil, sorry.
I don't think I've really got anything to add to what Ken said. I think it's very helpful to hear Ben say that he sees that role for essentially knowledge, know-how, and I think if what you're saying is those circumstances in which there is a credible commercial reason to actually preserve that know-how, then that, if that is indeed in the benefit ultimately of the patient's interest, then that's something that we should be open to considering protection of, then I agree. But perhaps I'm misquoting you.
Susan, do you want to comment?
Yes, I was very pleased to hear Kent's intervention. I mean, just before we got to the coffee break, I was beginning to wonder what is the role of the regulator here, and thought maybe we could cut him out as the middleman. But in fact, we are very pleased to submit all our data to the regulator so that they can assess the benefit risk. And very importantly, as Kent mentioned, what we do more and more of now, in particular in the light of the most recent pharmacovigilance legislation, is submit ongoing data so that we reevaluate the risk benefit for the lifetime of the product.
Peter.
Of course, regulators are trying to do a good job, but let me just remind you that there are political pressures also in Europe, but particularly in the States, where about 70% of FDA scientists in an opinion poll said that they didn't feel that the drugs that FDA brought onto the market were safe. So there is a huge problem, and diabetes is one such black box, where, for example, muraglitazar was about being approved by the FDA. They had already written the approval letter when some people got access to what the FDA had in their possession and find out this is harmful, and then it was never approved. And for Avandia, Glaxo hid the harmful data for many years, and it was again the FDA that Nissen in America went into the FDA's website and looked at the data that were there and found out that Avandia was harmful. And then we deregistered it in Europe. So you're under immense political pressure, and we only want to help you. Please understand this. I'm speaking privately now, but I feel that this is how we think in the Cochrane collaboration. We can help you make a far better job by allowing us to get access to the data. We don't want all these drug catastrophes.
Actually, the concept of speaking privately, where not only is it being videoed, it's being live video streamed and people are twittering, I'm not sure about the privacy. But I hear what you're saying. You're not speaking for the Cochrane collaboration when you say that. Ken wants to come back.
Very briefly, I think I really have to challenge the proposition of political pressure. I can't speak for systems outside the EU, but I certainly, having been in regulation for the last 9 years, have not felt a sense that there was political pressure. I think we're talking about the genuine difficulties over the interpretation of data, and I would go back to what I was saying earlier. At the point of market authorization, I think that the processes in place are well set up to provide a robust and valid interpretation of risk and benefit. The difficulty comes up years down the track, and I think you refer to the example of rosiglitazone, where clearly the interval between initial market authorization and the point at which the license fundamentally had to be changed saw a huge shift, not only in the evidence base, but in our expectations of a treatment for diabetes. And I think it slightly muddies the water to confuse those two situations.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's have some more comments from the audience. There's a gentleman over there, with your hand up.
Thank you very much.
No, it wasn't you, sorry.
Wasn't?
You're unfortunately, you're directly in line with the person I'm getting at. I'll give you a go in a second. Use your microphone.
Markus Hartmann, ECC Oncology. There's obviously a link between trial sponsorship and data ownership. And this is clear when you look to GCP, where sometimes wording is used, the trial sponsor and or data owner. My question to EMA is, will you consider the concept of data ownership in this new framework, like it is also done in UDOR Vigilance, for example, where you have a clear assignment of data ownership on the website? It is clear that investment, collecting data, analyzing data, interpreting data is of importance for those who made it, who invested in it, and therefore it's also related to publication rights. It's a question for trial sponsors, either academic or commercial.
I think this isn't for EMA to give the answer this afternoon, it's to hear your view. Who does own the data? Who owns the data? You tell us your opinion.
I think that it's clear and obvious link that those who invest inside should be also considered as data owners.
Right. And what about the patients?
In terms of the data which are in fact assembled, which are analyzed, interpreted, it's anonymized data.
Okay, so they have no interest in it.
They have an interest in, it's clear, but the investment again here, if it's an academic or an commercial sponsor, the investment has been made by those who made all this trial, and it's a lot of work, and therefore I think it's important to have kind of acknowledgement of this investment.
Thank you for that. Your turn.
Is it really my turn?
Yeah, it's really your turn.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Jefferson, Cochrane Acute Respiratory Infections Group, long mouth. I've got a brief question for our hosts, the EMA, and a simple yes or no answer will do, and I don't want to take your time. I'm talking about a drug for which a market authorization, the decision has already been made, the case is closed. The question is, have you got the powers to request any missing parts of clinical study reports or missing full clinical study reports? Thank you.
Do you want to answer? Yeah.
You say the brief answer, yes.
Okay, that's perfect question and answer. Thank you.
Perfect answer.
Good. Okay, yeah, your turn.
Hi, Peter Doshi, Johns Hopkins University. I want to ask a question about misleading analyses because this was a focus of so much the discussion before the break. My question is really somewhat of a challenge. What are the examples of misleading analyses that have resulted from the open sharing of clinical trial data. Because I think we all want to avoid misleading analyses, and I think we can best do that if we learn from the case studies. So I'd like to hear what the examples are in people's minds.
Okay, well, that's a question for the panel, I think. Okay, over here, we'll have a few more questions.
Yes, Trudeau Lemmens, University of Toronto and visiting in Oxford. I want to react to the argument that there is an ethical issue in giving too much access to the data. And I'm actually seriously concerned about it because I have the impression that patient interest and privacy rights are used to give industry proprietary control over data without the public actually fully understanding that, and in a way that runs counter to what privacy rights really are about, which is, in the healthcare context particularly, to allow people to make informed decisions about their own patient care. So in a way, it seems to me simply perverse to use a privacy right as a tool that can harm actually the very patients who should be able to make informed decisions about their healthcare. And I think actually the public should be fully aware of that and fully informed that the privacy rights are used to strengthen proprietary rights of industry, and that industry already has a reward by the patent system for the production of the data and then the drugs that they bring on the market.
Okay. Yep.
Susan Batty. I'm president of the European Medical Rights Association, and I work for a global contract research organization. I just wanted to point out that it's not only the authorities who are involved when it comes to clinical trials, there are ethics committees involved also. And this is in every single country in which the study is submitted. And from my own experience, I do this every day, those ethics committees are extremely concerned about patient data privacy and extremely concerned that the patients are giving absolutely full informed consent to the use of the data that is collected during that trial. Now, if you are proposing to make it publicly accessible to anybody, then I think you're going to have to talk to the ethics committees, and I haven't heard any ethics committees in this room today before you do that, because you're going to have to get them on board too. And the other thing that I'd like to say is that currently in the US, data is sent to the FDA, as we've already heard, the SAS data sets are sent on CDISC. I don't see any reason why the same thing shouldn't happen in Europe. Then the EMA would have the data and could then perhaps provide that to people who wish to have access to it and wished to reevaluate it. So I don't see that for most of the global pharma industry would be an enormous problem.
We've heard the issue of patient privacy come up several times. Maybe I can ask Giovanni to come back on effectively anonymized data.
That's a simple issue. As said, in a large number of cases we are dealing with, individuals remain identifiable. So this is why in the framework of the consultation to the agency, but also in our comments, informal comments to the draft regulation on clinical trials, we strongly recommended to also work on other identifiers. So any perspective on informed consent is related to other processing operations where, okay, data are used for the well-known purposes, but I don't think the EDPS will be in the condition to, accept that the agency makes publicly available data concerning identifiable individuals. As said, we should distinguish different categories of data subjects, so we may have a different conclusion concerning, for instance, employees of pharmaceutical companies as well as, investigators. But with regard to data subjects, we should start from the assumption that the relevant provisions in the Regulation 45 2001 and in the directive to be applied by member states starts from the basic point that the dissemination is prohibited as such. Having the floor, may I come back for a second to a question which remained a little bit unanswered. Disclosure of data concerning data subjects outside the EU. I don't think that the relevant pieces of legislation make a difference concerning, nationality of relevant individuals where they reside. So the protection is global, regardless of the place where they are established. So crucial is again to come back to the modalities. And see whether by making those data publicly available to everybody, there is or not a transfer of data to third countries. So it's not, again, a yes or not perspective. We may work on modalities, including, again, the use of internal search engines by not making certain data traceable by using external search engines such as Google. So we need to be creative. Eh?
Okay, thanks. There are some more hands up. Over there.
Thank you very much. Ian Chalmers, James Lind Initiative. I just want to raise a question about the role of ethics committees in all of this, as it's been raised. There's a sort of assumption that ethics committees occupy moral high ground. Yet there's a lot of evidence that they don't. I've been interested in the issue of biased underpublication of research for a quarter of a century. The ethics committees have been notable by their absence for making any effort to move us forward in this field. And I think I'd want to go back to the point that David Healy made. A patient who gives consent to participate in a clinical trial should be given written confirmation that the results will be published and that anyone who wants to have those results as a participant will get copies of them, and that if that cannot be offered as a guarantee to patients, they ought to be made aware of the fact that the results will be withheld for other people's interests. So let's not take it that ethics committees provide us with a sound moral compass. The way that they have behaved on this matter, unfortunately, does not allow us to assume that.
The wonderful thing about this meeting, the wonderful thing about this meeting is that no one is coming out unscathed. I think as long as everyone is criticised, I think we're all right. So thank you for that, Ian. Woman in the front there, and then there's two on the right here.
My name is Josie Drabwell, and I represent patients with a primary immunodeficiency. From a patient perspective, I'm delighted that the results, negative or positive, will be available to us. I might need somebody to explain the data to me, but I'm sure that can be arranged. But if I can have access to that information, I'm concerned that perhaps people from health insurance companies would also have access to that.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we can come back to that. Over here.
Hi, my name is Dominic Way. I'm a doctoral researcher at King's College London in risk analysis. I think what Kent said is something that's very important to this debate. And from my position, I say that communicating risk-benefit information effectively is crucial. In conjunction, Mark also highlighted that there is a difference between data, information, and knowledge. Has this distinction been made in this transparency debate and by the EMA? Thank you.
Okay. I think there was another one over here. Yep.
Yes, thank you. My name is Martin Hildebrand from Munich, Germany, and I'm a member of the Ethics Committee of the City of Berlin. And just to mention...
right. Guilty as charged.
What my colleagues from the Department of Legal Affairs tell me is that the intellectual property cannot be covered by patent law, and that the raw data remain in the possession of the participants in the clinical trial. And what the people from the IT department tell me, and I strongly believe them, is that there is no technical obstacle to giving patients and participants in clinical trials access to their data whenever they want to, wherever they want to, and to enable them and their doctors to grant access to their data to any person they want to, and thus retain them in the possession of their own data. and perhaps that hasn't been too much in the focus of today's debate.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back to the panel. Can I just get a sort of rough show of hands as to who wants to come in, or whether you're getting exhausted or not? Because there's a couple. Okay, there's a couple more. I'll come back to the panel. We'll have one more round of questions and comments, and then we'll have a summing up by the panel. I think, to tackle two questions with the panel, and you don't all need to answer, so volunteer if you want. The first question is, who owns the data? And in fact, is ownership of the data in itself a useful concept? That's my first question. And I think the second one was, can anyone give an example of a harm that has flowed from a meta-analysis? And that could include a commercial harm. Who wants to have a go at those questions? Come on, someone. Neil, do you want to have a go? Well, you see, the gentleman in the middle wants to have a go. Go on then.
I just want to clarify that my question wasn't harm from a meta-analysis. It's specifically harm from a misleading analysis that resulted from the sharing of clinical trial data. So we're talking about open sharing leads to harms. Because I can think of many misleading analyses myself, but not in that category.
Neil?
Yeah, I was going to take on the question of who owns the data. And I think, Mark, you perhaps suggested that if indeed the funder owned the data, that would infer that the patient had no interest. And I think we would recognise that patients undoubtedly has a huge interest in, and I hope that's recognised ultimately by using that data, us bringing better medicines. I think there has to be a recognition that insofar as there's a very significant investment made to achieve that data, unless the ownership in the context of what can be used to then bring about pharmaceuticals is not owned by the funder, then the likelihood of continuing funding of these sort of activities in the future will be constrained.
Okay. Giovanni, you wanted to come in?
The notion of ownership may have a value with regard to the confidentiality, the commercial confidentiality, but there are other notions to be considered as well, starting from the notion of controllership. Mm-hmm. Who's the controller and to which an extent where the controllership of the agency starts. And if we speak about individuals, let me be a little bit provocative. The owner is first the data subject if we start from the analysis of the new fundamental right to the protection of personal data. There is one final element which was a little bit underestimated in the debate. If we speak about information concerning legal person, there are cases where the information as such, although it relates to an area where the regulation 45 is not to be applied, since we are not speaking about individuals, there are informations concerning individuals which are in the information on the legal person, and this requires particular information. Having the floor, and as announced, I need to leave earlier, I would like to, let me say, encourage, invite, recommend, suggest the agency to carefully consider the announced perspective to issue a guidance document for competent national authorities. I think this is a key test. What you are going to explore will have an impact at national level. So in opening your public consultation, if this is the case, please also be clear and try to also take on board relevant experiences, and perhaps it could be a learning exercise for all. Thank you for your contribution. Sorry for leaving it.
No, well, thank you very much. Can we thank you for coming, actually? Okay, I think we're sort of exhausting the discussion, so I'm going to have one more round of questions. So speak now, forever hold your tongue, and there are more hands going up. And then I'm going to ask the panel to answer any of those questions they like and make their concluding comments, and I will go around everyone. So you're lots of agitated hands going up.
True dilemma is very quickly again about ownership of the data. My question would be, why would we give companies commercial interest over the data when they are already protected against unfair use of the data through data exclusivity regimes? And a second issue is that we have to keep in mind that these data are produced in the context of a regulatory regime that was introduced to promote drug safety and effectiveness. And so it seems odd in a way that the regulatory regime that was set up to promote safety and efficacy data has now been used as a new tool to create exclusivity, which is already in a way granted through the data protection regime.
Okay. Hands over here. Use the microphone. Tell us your name.
On the practical issues, does the EMA feel that there would be some sort of giant repository of data that may or may not be tapped into? I'd like to get some feeling of the actual design here in terms of there will have to be a common repository language, there'll have to be an ontology, there'll have to be an index, there'll have to be quite a lot of actual hard work if this is going to go from leaving the station today and ending up in utopia. I'd just like to have an idea that if all this work takes place, and only 1 or 2% of the data is actually accessed, that's rather a waste of money or hitting the wrong nut.
I don't think we're asking the EMA questions this afternoon. We're telling them the answers, and I sort of think you've implicitly told us your answer.
I just wanted to know if it is actually going to be a giant repository.
What should it be in your view?
Well, I think it should be a hose that if someone needs access to data, and this is what my position would be, then the actual pharmaceutical company can actually facilitate through a commonality, a framework, so that data gets to the person, rather than going to the expense of setting up a complete colossus and only finding that the flavour of the month changes.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Mark Edwards, R&D Director for a pharma SME trade association called EMIG, and long history in clinical development in industry. If we are talking here, strictly speaking, about clinical trial data following a marketing application decision by a regulator, whatever that be, and that the discussion is entirely focused on the clinical trial data and nothing else that might have gone into the marketing authorization, I, as a clinical trialist from industry, would frankly very much favour as open access as possible. Because when it comes to clinical trial era, I'm struggling to actually really think about what is truly, truly, truly commercially sensitive in terms of know-how IP at that stage, in all honesty. And it would have greatly helped my work in industry and some of my colleagues if we'd had fuller open access to data sets worldwide. Advantages, we talked about, or started to talk about incentives for pharma earlier. We would have undoubtedly had the opportunity to design clinical trial programs faster and perhaps more effectively, with perhaps earlier identification of the likely responder populations, of great interest now with everybody's focus on stratification. We could probably have helped at times curtail development programs or not even start them, and therefore divert your budget elsewhere for programs that might not have had a good chance of going anywhere. And quite frankly, we could have saved an awful lot of money on key opinion leader budgets and ad boards and panels, because there's a whole industry there of KOLs who go around the world telling lots of companies exactly the same information. I do think that, so if there is commercial sensitivity in aspects of the strict clinical trial data that I don't recognise, that's absolutely fine. But I think colleagues in industry do need to take a real honest look at the benefit-risk ratio of actually giving something up to actually maybe look at the gains from actually having a wider access to other industry
So that was a very direct challenge. Susan and Neil, respond to that, please.
Right, so I started off this afternoon by requesting that the EMA would talk to us when they want to release these data, and then we have the opportunity to establish whether in that data set, clinical trial, whatever it is, there are information that we regard as commercially confidential or not.
Could you try and give us an example of that?
Well, I think that if you are later in the life cycle, clearly the vast majority of companies are going to be very happy that the clinical study report be published. There's absolutely no problem about that. If you are early in the life cycle and you haven't got a compound patent, those data can be taken and used either within the EU, where we don't have a firm legislative basis for covering for parallel submissions, or outside of the EU. They can take those data, and using those data, they'll be able to submit.
And how much of that sort of data would be in an EMA authorization package?
All of it. I mean, you'll have...
Of unpatented compounds?
Well, I've had a look, and it's a small but steady stream. Right. And so in the last 2 years, both years, there's 2 to 3 products which will not have a compound of matter patent. So it is small, but it's there. And if you're a really small company, or even if you're a big company, and you've made this enormous investment, it doesn't seem the right thing to do. And all that we're asking as EFPIA is that the EMA would discuss with us before they do the release, so at least we have the opportunity, in certain cases, to point out what the risks could be.
So can you give us an idea, and this is a slightly unfair question, but why shouldn't I be unfair, of what percentage of the submissions are we talking about being redacted, as it were? Are we talking about 0.1%, or are we talking about something more than that?
I don't understand the question.
Well, I'm just trying to work out how much of your material you really think is commercial in confidence. Are we talking about something at the margins of the authorization packages, as it were?
Well, I think that depending on the product and the nature of the product and where you are in the life cycle, you may not wish to redact anything out of the clinical study report. But there will be other times when, if you don't have adequate intellectual property protection for one reason or another, then there will be information that clearly could just be taken as is. And the difficulty is that the more information that's available and the more you take, the easier the life is for the competitor making their submissions outside of the European Union.
But what I'm trying to get at is, are we talking at the margins, or are we talking about a substantial fraction of the material we're talking about?
On a given dossier?
Yeah, on a given dossier, is it the margins or is it 50% of it?
Well, on a given dossier, if it's a medicine for which you don't have a patent at all, you would be very anxious about your clinical studies being used by a competitor. If you're fully protected, I think that there are a lot of companies who will be perfectly okay that those clinical study reports be published.
No, I don't think so. I think we'll stay with the panel for the moment, and then we'll have last questions. Neil. Neil.
Nothing to add. What Sue described.
All right. Very, very brief comment.
At least in Canada, the companies have right to patent before they go to human studies. Decision they don't patent is because then they can control the price of the drug later on the market. And we've been fighting that in Canada quite a bit. So they can patent the molecule, the compound, up the front. And if they decide not to do so because they can get better price for their drug eventually, it's their risk.
I think we'll leave that one. I think actually. Okay, there were some more questions. More hands? Have we run out? Oh no, I think you've had a go. Sorry?
It's still an unanswered question. No one has answered the question. Any example of any harm that has come from data being shared?
Well, you can take the silence to interpret any way you like. Okay, more. I've thrown the question open. The panel will have another go. It's been asked 3 times. You haven't heard an answer. You can interpret how you like.
So my name is Fergal O'Regan. I'm head of unit with the European Ombudsman. Just to go back on the issue of the legal framework that applies to access to document, the first principle is that access should be given. The exception to that principle is, which must be proven, is that if there is damage to a commercial interest, access can be either withheld or limited. But it's for the party that argues that that exception applies to prove it. And what the European courts have stated is that when you seek to prove it, you must put forward reasons which are reasonably foreseeable and not purely hypothetical. And if one were to put forward that you might possibly use the clinical data at some point in time in the future to develop, let's say, alternative products or work through alternative indications, that would seem to me to be hypothetical. It needs to be reasonably foreseeable. And once you arrive at that point, you must still balance those interests with the public interest in order to determine whether there's an overriding public interest. So I have certain concerns when I hear Mr. Weir, who seem to go from the presumption that the data, that the release of the data will damage commercial interests. No such presumption can be made. It must be proven that that actually is the case. And the onus is on the party that seeks to withhold the data to prove that, not the other way around.
Okay, so you've had an ombudsman opinion on that. You can respond to it in a minute if you like. Okay, last few questions. Okay, one there, then there's a few over there, and then that's it, I think. Go on.
Yes, Philippe Lechat I'm a pharmacologist and working in partnership with the French Drug Agency. From an academic point of view, one of the, obviously, of the interest to have access to some data is to make supplementary clinical research, and especially to provide analysis of comparative effectiveness between different drugs. Indeed, at the email level and authorities, marketing authorization are given based on the data from the dossier and basically from placebo-controlled trials and from comparative trials. But basically from the Cochrane point of view also, one of the main objectives is indeed to perform such analysis. And for that, we indeed need part of the data from the clinical trials. And my point is, knowing exactly which kind of data companies provide to the agency and to EMA and to all the agency of the network, the data are not, it's very difficult to work on the data because they are not presented as, and someone alluded to the FDA way of working. Companies provide the FDA the data according to, and they are allowing the FDA to make the analysis again. This is not the case here in Europe. So when you look at the real data given by the companies from a clinical trial, it's a hard work to pick up the data you want and to rebuild the analysis. So my question is, and even in the files, the individual data on efficacy are not there. You have to ask them to the company to have additional data. So my question is, would it be possible, as previously asked, to ask the company to have the data file analyzable with statistical devices? And if we require the individual data, will it be possible to ask them to the companies through the email?
Okay, thank you. There's been a lot from Cochrane. I just want to ask Cochrane one question, and I know the answer actually, but are Cochrane reviews available open access?
The governments pay for access in a lot of countries. So in half the world, the half of the world's population have access to Cochrane reviews because the governments pay for prescription.
But what about the other half of the world?
They can read the abstracts. I'm sorry, we would love to have free access, but we also need some money to drive the Cochrane collaboration.
Aha. Okay, thank you for that. Okay. There's a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Durish. I'm from the Berne Declaration Advocacy NGO, member of the Health Action International Network. I'd like to come back to some more pragmatic issues. I still think that there are some unanswered questions regarding the timeline. On the one hand, there's a decision by the EMA to proactively publish, and that's what it says in the invitation, and enable access to full data sets. So there is a decision. So what's the timeline behind? Although we do have today a stakeholder consultation, obviously there are very divided opinions on whether there should be full access or not. I think we should have full access. But what's the timeline? I mean, what are the next steps? I mean, it's still very unclear.
What should be the timeline?
As soon as possible, I would say.
Okay, thank you. All right. I think this must be the last question. Okay, so last question, and then I go around the panel, and then I'm going to hand over to Hans-Georg.
I just would like to give one example of the harm of disclosing the data. Reference was made to data exclusivity providing sufficient protection. If you look at Article 25A of the Australian Therapeutic Goods Act, it says data exclusivity is granted, but it is not available when the data are available to the public. By just making everything available by the EMA, you wipe out the data exclusivity rights in Australia. You do that in several countries. So there is proven harm. It's far from hypothetical.
Okay. All right. Well, you've been a lively audience, so I'm just going to turn to the panel now. Your last thoughts and remarks. Peter.
Thank you. I have a fantastic example before we go home of how important it is to get access to data. The New York State attorney alleged that GlaxoSmithKline had committed consumer fraud with Paxil, its antidepressant drug. And as part of the settlement, Glaxo was forced to put out its trials on a publicly accessible database. This allowed Nissen, I was wrong before, it was not the FDA data, but this allowed Nissen and Wolski to have a closer look at rosiglitazone. And out of 42 trials, Glaxo had only published 27 of them. Please remark this. And they then showed that this drug causes myocardial infarction and cardiovascular death. And 3 years later, it was removed from the market in Europe. So please, it really matters to get access.
Thank you. Susan?
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the organisers of this meeting this afternoon very much indeed for the opportunity to having tried to present the industry view. And as we go forward, I hope that we'll be able to work together with the EMA and the other stakeholders to advance a balanced approach in fostering transparency.
Thank you. Neil?
Similarly, I'd like to thank the EMA for hosting. I think it's been very illuminating discussion. I hope, and I'm sure everybody will go away, that everyone on the panel, whether they're coming from a different perspective, one perspective or another, actually is passionately trying to find the next set of medicines for patients. And there are, just as you have seen, interesting and sometimes disparate perspectives on the process for doing that. But I'm very confident that's the case.
Okay, Ben?
There's absolutely no doubt that patients are harmed by withholding access to clinical trial data. I think it's unarguable, and I think anybody who wants to claim that their commercial rights as a company are more important than patient safety must make that argument in public to patients who are taking their drugs. I'm very, very pleased just finally to say it's just been announced that the Health Select Committee in the UK Parliament will be having an urgent inquiry into the withholding of clinical trial data. And I hope that this is, along with this meeting, the beginning of the end of a very, very dark period in medical history.
Virginia.
So, I mean, just to reiterate, this is going to happen, which is great. We're now discussing how it's going to happen. We've had no good arguments, I think, put up that this will cause harm other than potential commercial harm if it is not implemented in a way, well, if it will have ramifications around the world. We've heard about the Australian example. I think that makes it even more important that this becomes a global issue. We've heard opinions that this would save money, and I support that. I think there are lots of practical issues to be dealt with, but they're all completely surmountable. And I think we need to work together and set a deadline for implementation of this. I really don't want to be having this discussion again in a year's time.
François?
Even if the examples of controversies of misleading analyses are not there yet because public release of data has not happened yet. And we are interested in having others having a look. The risk is potential, is theoretical, but it has already happened in many domains, not only the genetically modified organism I mentioned earlier. And we are still in a position to avoid that confusion coming from diverging publications that are public, that become public, before there is even a chance that those who have other findings can discuss with those who have other primary findings. And this is what we need to organize and have place, a platform where diverging results can be confronted to each other before they come public, because when they come public, I can't see where controversies, noise, confusion can really help society.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to finish by thanking everyone here, thanking in particular the panel. And I think I've got a plea, really, which is that drugs have done an enormous amount of good. Patients with cancer survive who didn't survive before. Drugs can also cause harm. And the challenge actually is to get the balance between the benefits and the risks right and communicate them clearly. But it is the drug industry, the pharma industry, that makes drugs. And I think that my plea is that rather than people on this rather divided platform talking at each other, that they talk to each other, because I think that's the best way to move it forward. The arguments for transparency are very strong indeed. But actually how that transparency is achieved, I think, is something that's got to be worked out very carefully. And I do again draw the distinction between data, information, and knowledge. And what we ultimately want is information that can be aggregated to form knowledge. Just the random putting out garbage in, garbage out, no useful information, no knowledge. So I think this has been, from my perspective at least, interesting, quite challenging to chair. But I do think that the way forward is to talk, and it is about communicating and not just shouting at each other. And I think everyone's done pretty well at that today. So thank you all, and I'm going to hand over to Hans-Georg now.
Thank you, Sir Mark. In concluding this session, I would like to start where Gøtzsche left off earlier this afternoon. He made three key statements. The first one was, this process is irreversible. He used the word irreversibility. Then he said, we're not here to talk if, but how. So this is the beginning of a journey. And you may have wondered why the EMA was so quiet today. Well, the third message he gave was, today we listen, and listening means shut up and listen, and you talked. And I want to use that opportunity to thank my colleagues from the EMA for exercising so much self-discipline in actually shutting up, even though it was sometimes difficult. So now you may ask yourself, what is the next step in the journey? And the question came up, what are we going to do today? We have a very clear plan. We understood from the beginning that we would not have the conclusions today. And the one point where I disagree with Virginia is that even if we're here for 48 hours, we might not have sorted everything out. It will be a longer journey. But we want to do this. We want to do it in the most open and inclusive way possible. Therefore, we will cut one big problem into a few smaller problems. We understand that there are several sub-issues here, and we would invite everybody in this room and who listens and whoever wants to be, to join us and form an advisory group to propose policies to us that we will then either take on or politely and with good arguments, hopefully not take on. And the 5 work streams or advisory groups will be the ones that are on this slide. As we were speaking, we have adapted that slide as you were speaking because we understood where the issues are, so we have learned from your conversation. So the key issue will be protecting patient confidentiality. We will be talking about clinical trial data formats. That will mostly be a technical debate group. We will talk about rules of engagement. So can everybody have everything? Will there be 2 tiers or whatever the case may be? We will also talk about good analysis practice. Much has been said about false, misleading secondary analysis. That is an important point. And we will have to address the legal aspect. So these 5 groups. Now, we want all these groups to be balanced, to have at least membership from the groups that are listed on this slide. We will act as the coordinators. We need to have patient or patient groups on board, the pharmaceutical industry, of course, research institutions, associations, NGOs, whatever you may be, and of course, healthcare professionals and academia. We ask you to limit your expressions of interest to one member per organization. We're not helped if we get 10 people from one, say, company or university. There is no conditions. Please nominate yourself. The only real condition is a commitment to contribute to this process, to give your time. You will not be paid for it. You don't have to pay. We will take up the organization. We will set up teleconferences, face-to-face meetings, whatever the case may be. All you have to give is time. What is the schedule? And there was a question, well, when will that happen? Please, if you're interested in contributing to the exercise, visit our website. As of the beginning of December, there will be a dedicated space on the website where you can then register your expression of interest. We will be receiving those until just before Christmas, the 21st of December. Then it will be closed. We anticipate that the initial sessions for each group to be convened will be during January, February, and we hope to have an agreed-upon advice by the end of April. Now, given the, shall we say, disparity of opinion here, it may happen that there will not be one agreed-upon advice by all stakeholders. We will still go on. It is our responsibility. It will be our policy. So therefore, we will wait until 30th of April. Whatever comes in, we will gratefully acknowledge, but then we will draft our policy that will be done by the end of June 2013. Of course, this will go up for public consultation on our website until the end of September 2013, so the entire summer. This is a 3-month period. We believe this should be enough. And then we will, of course, take into account any other comments we receive, and we will publish a final policy by the end of November 2013 with a view to having this come into force on the 1st of January 2014. So that is the timeline, and I hope that answers the questions. Please watch our website if you're interested. Now, with that, the only thing that is left to me is to thank everybody. Most notably, all of you. You have been, as Mark said, a fantastic audience and very contributory. I want to thank the panel. Thank you so much for making yourself available for very openly give your positions. And lastly, I want to thank 2 individuals. One is Hanneke Parkinson, who basically managed this whole conference and made it happen. And the last is Sir Mark Walport, who did a stellar performance in mediating and chairing this. Thank you so much.